In the vast deserts of North Africa in 1941 and 1942, war was not only fought by tanks and infantry, it was fought by trucks. Endless columns of fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, and supply vehicles crawled across hundreds of kilometers of open desert. Without them, no army could survive. Tanks could not move, artillery could not fire, and soldiers could not eat. These convoys were the lifeline of the Allied armies, but to the pilots of the German Luftwaffe, they were something else entirely. They were targets. In the early phase of the North African campaign, German pilots quickly realized that destroying supply convoys was far easier than attacking heavily defended airfields or armored formations. The desert offered almost no cover. From the air, a convoy could be spotted from many kilometers away, a long trail of dust stretching across the sand like a road drawn in smoke. Once located, the attack was simple. Fighters and dive bombers would drop low, sometimes flying only a few meters above the ground, and begin strafing runs along the length of the convoy. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were not originally designed for ground attack, but in North Africa they proved terrifyingly effective. Their speed allowed pilots to make sudden passes, firing their cannons and machine guns directly into trucks packed with fuel or ammunition. Even more feared was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, a dive bomber that had already gained a deadly reputation earlier in the war. The Stuka would climb high above the convoy, then plunge downward in a steep dive, releasing bombs before pulling up just above the desert floor. For the soldiers driving those trucks, the experience was terrifying. Convoys moved slowly, sometimes only 20 or 30 kilometers per hour. Drivers had little protection, and the vehicles themselves were often unarmored. A single strafing run could destroy multiple trucks in seconds. If a fuel tanker exploded, the blast could ignite vehicles nearby. Ammunition trucks might detonate with such force that debris scattered across the desert. The geography of North Africa made the situation even worse. Unlike forests or cities in Europe, the desert offered almost nowhere to hide. There were no buildings, few hills, and almost no natural cover. When aircraft appeared overhead, convoy drivers often had only one option: stop the vehicles and scatter into the sand. The trucks themselves became easy targets, lined up in long, predictable formations. German pilots began to treat convoy attacks almost like routine patrol work. A Luftwaffe pilot flying reconnaissance might spot a convoy and radio its position. Within minutes, fighters or dive bombers could arrive to strike. The attacks were quick, violent, and often devastating. A single formation of aircraft could cripple a supply column that had taken days to assemble. The psychological effect on convoy crews was enormous. Drivers knew that at any moment the sky could suddenly roar with the sound of engines. The first warning was often the scream of diving aircraft or the flash of tracers hitting the sand around them. Some drivers described the attacks as feeling completely helpless, like being hunted in the open. British convoys at the time were particularly vulnerable. Most trucks were lightly armed, and many had no mounted heavy weapons at all. Defensive fire usually came from rifles or light machine guns, weapons designed for infantry combat rather than anti-aircraft defense. Against fast-moving aircraft diving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, these weapons offered little protection. Because of this imbalance, German pilots grew increasingly confident in their convoy hunting tactics. They learned to approach from the direction of the sun to reduce the chance of being spotted. Some pilots attacked along the length of the convoy, maximizing the number of vehicles exposed to their guns. Others focused specifically on fuel trucks, knowing that destroying fuel could immobilize entire armored divisions. Reports from Luftwaffe units during this period showed just how effective these tactics were. Pilots described columns of burning vehicles stretching across the desert. In many cases, convoys had to abandon damaged trucks simply to keep moving. Every destroyed vehicle meant fewer supplies reaching the front lines. Convoy hunting also had strategic importance. The North African campaign was fought across enormous distances.
Fuel and ammunition had to travel hundreds of kilometers from ports to the front. If those supply lines were disrupted, entire offensives could collapse. Luftwaffe commanders understood this perfectly. Destroying logistics was often more valuable than destroying tanks. For German pilots, these missions carried a certain grim efficiency. They were dangerous, but compared to dogfights with enemy fighters or attacks against defended positions, convoy strafing often seemed easier. The trucks could not fight back effectively, they could not maneuver quickly, and they were always visible against the endless pale background of the desert. By late 1942, Luftwaffe pilots operating over North Africa had become highly skilled at this type of warfare. Convoy attacks had turned into a deadly routine. Aircraft would sweep across the desert, searching for dust trails that revealed moving columns. Once found, the attack would begin almost immediately. But this routine success would not last forever. The arrival of new Allied forces in North Africa would soon change the rules of the game in a way German pilots had not anticipated. The convoys they had learned to hunt so easily were about to become something far more dangerous than anyone in the Luftwaffe expected.
In November 1942, the war in North Africa changed almost overnight. For months, German pilots flying for the Luftwaffe had grown used to hunting Allied convoys across the open desert. The tactics had become routine: spot the dust cloud, dive low, fire along the line of trucks, and disappear before ground fire could respond. Many pilots saw convoy attacks as some of the easiest missions in the theater. The trucks were slow, poorly defended, and spread across vast, empty landscapes where there was nowhere to hide. Then the landings began. The Allied invasion, known as Operation Torch, brought thousands of American troops into North Africa. Huge fleets crossed the Atlantic, carrying men, vehicles, and supplies to Morocco and Algeria. For German and Italian commanders, the invasion was alarming enough on its own. But what arrived with those American forces would soon create a deadly surprise in the desert skies. American convoys looked similar to British ones at first glance. Long columns of trucks moved across dusty roads, carrying fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food for advancing troops. Jeeps bounced over rough terrain, while half-tracks hauled soldiers and equipment toward the front lines. To German reconnaissance pilots flying high above, these convoys looked like the same kind of targets they had been attacking for over a year. But there was a crucial difference. Nearly every American vehicle was armed. Mounted on the back of trucks, on the ring mounts of half-tracks, and sometimes even on simple improvised pedestals, was a weapon that many German pilots had not expected to see everywhere: the heavy machine gun known as the M2 Browning. American soldiers had given it a nickname that would become legendary: the Ma Deuce. Unlike the light machine guns commonly found in earlier convoys, this weapon fired powerful .50 caliber rounds capable of reaching aircraft flying at considerable distance. It had originally been developed decades earlier, near the end of the First World War, when military planners realized aircraft were becoming stronger and faster. Engineers wanted a weapon that could punch through armor plating and disable aircraft engines. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, the weapon had become a cornerstone of American military doctrine. Commanders believed that logistics units should never be completely defenseless. Supply trucks might not be frontline combat vehicles, but they were too valuable to leave unprotected. If enemy aircraft attacked, every convoy vehicle needed the ability to fight back. This philosophy produced convoys that looked very different from the air. Instead of a few scattered defensive guns, American supply columns often carried dozens of heavy machine guns. Truck drivers, mechanics, and transport soldiers were trained to use them. Many vehicles carried spare ammunition boxes stacked beside the gun mounts. When an attack came, multiple gunners could open fire simultaneously. To Luftwaffe pilots used to attacking lightly defended targets, the first encounters were shocking.
German reconnaissance aircraft still spotted convoys the same way they always had, by following trails of dust across the desert. Fighter pilots flying aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 would descend to low altitude, preparing for the familiar attack pattern. Dive in, strafe along the column, pull up, and escape before ground fire could react. But when these pilots opened fire on American convoys, something very different happened. Instead of a few scattered rifle shots, the sky suddenly erupted with streams of heavy tracer fire. Dozens of .50 caliber machine guns would begin firing at once. The bullets streaked upward in bright glowing lines, forming a dense wall of fire that aircraft had to fly directly through. The effect was immediate and terrifying. At low altitude, aircraft were extremely vulnerable. Pilots needed to fly straight during strafing runs in order to aim their guns effectively. But flying straight toward a convoy filled with heavy machine guns meant flying directly into concentrated defensive fire. Engines, fuel tanks, and cockpits suddenly became targets. The M2 Browning was particularly dangerous for aircraft because its rounds carried tremendous energy. At close range, they could punch through engine components, damage cooling systems, or shatter cockpit glass. Even a few hits could cripple a fighter plane. American convoy crews quickly developed their own defensive tactics. When aircraft were spotted approaching, vehicles would often spread out slightly to avoid becoming clustered targets. Gunners would swing their weapons upward and begin tracking incoming aircraft. Because the guns were mounted high on vehicles, they could elevate enough to fire at steep angles. American convoy gunners had never fired at aircraft before arriving in North Africa, but the weapon itself was forgiving and powerful. Even near misses forced attacking pilots to fly through a dangerous storm of metal. German pilots soon realized that these were not the same convoys they had been attacking earlier in the campaign. What once looked like a line of helpless trucks now behaved more like a moving anti-aircraft battery. Reports from the Luftwaffe units began mentioning the unexpected intensity of American ground fire. Some pilots described entire convoys firing simultaneously, creating what looked like a curtain of tracers rising from the desert floor. Flying through that curtain meant gambling with their lives every time they attacked. At first, many pilots assumed the resistance was temporary or exaggerated. After all, convoy strafing had worked so well for so long. But as more encounters occurred, it became clear that American supply columns had fundamentally changed the battlefield. The trucks still moved slowly, they still produced long trails of dust visible from kilometers away, but now those trails led to convoys that could shoot back with frightening power. For the Luftwaffe pilots who had grown comfortable hunting defenseless targets across the desert, the skies of North Africa were suddenly becoming far more dangerous than they had ever expected.
By early 1943, German pilots flying over North Africa had begun to realize that something had fundamentally changed. Convoy attacks that once seemed routine were becoming some of the most dangerous missions in the theater. The reason was not a new aircraft or a new radar system. It was a weapon mounted on the back of trucks. The heavy machine gun, known as the M2 Browning, had become almost universal across American convoys. Mechanics, drivers, radio operators, and transport troops all knew how to operate it. Wherever a convoy moved, dozens of these guns moved with it, and when aircraft attacked, they fired together. The weapon itself was deceptively simple. Designed by American engineer John Moses Browning, it fired massive .50 caliber rounds that were far larger than the ammunition used by most infantry machine guns. Each bullet weighed several times more than a standard rifle round and traveled at extremely high velocity. The result was a weapon capable of striking targets hundreds of meters away with devastating force. What made the weapon especially dangerous for aircraft was its range and penetration power. Aircraft attacking convoys usually flew very low to increase accuracy,
But at those altitudes, the heavy machine gun rounds could reach them easily. The bullets could punch through thin aircraft skin, damage engines, tear into radiators, or shatter cockpit instruments. And unlike traditional anti-aircraft guns, these machine guns were everywhere. A convoy might contain 30, 40, or even 50 vehicles. If half of them carried heavy machine guns, that meant 20 or more weapons firing at the same aircraft during an attack. Each gun fired hundreds of rounds per minute. When they all opened fire at once, the sky above the convoy filled with streaking tracer rounds. To a pilot diving toward a convoy, it looked like a rising storm of fire. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were incredibly fast and agile, but during a strafing run, they had to fly in a relatively straight line to aim their guns accurately. That moment of stability was exactly when convoy gunners focused their fire. Tracers climbed upward in dense streams, forcing attacking pilots to fly through the barrage if they wanted to hit their targets. The danger was not only the number of guns, but the angle of fire. Mounted on vehicle pedestals or ring mounts, the machine guns could elevate sharply upward. Gunners tracked aircraft as they approached, adjusting their aim constantly. Even if a plane passed overhead at high speed, multiple guns could still engage it as it climbed away. Pilots began to discover that even a few hits from a .50 caliber round could end a mission instantly. Fuel lines could rupture, oil systems could fail, control cables could snap. A damaged engine might seize within seconds. In the desert environment, a forced landing often meant capture or death. Dive bombers like the Junkers U-87 Stuka were even more vulnerable. The Stuka was designed for precision bombing, which meant it slowed down dramatically during its attack dive. That made it easier for gunners to track and hit. What had once been one of Germany's most feared weapons now had to descend directly into a wall of heavy machine gun fire. American convoy crews quickly learned how to maximize the effectiveness of their weapons. When an aircraft was spotted, drivers would sometimes spread their vehicles slightly across the road or desert track. This prevented a single strafing pass from hitting multiple trucks in a straight line. Meanwhile, gunners climbed into position, gripping the handles of their heavy machine guns and waiting for the aircraft to come within range. The moment the plane committed to its attack run, the gunners opened fire. Tracers arced upward in bright orange and red streaks. To the convoy crews, the sky looked alive with fire. To the attacking pilot, it looked like flying straight into a furnace. Many German pilots later described these encounters with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. What had once been simple targets were now capable of defending themselves with enormous firepower. Some pilots even reported convoys that appeared to fire continuously during attacks, with one gunner taking over when another paused to reload. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical danger. In air combat, pilots rely on confidence. They need to believe they can control the situation. But when attacking American convoys, that confidence began to disappear. Pilots could not easily predict where the heaviest fire would come from because almost every vehicle was armed. Instead of facing a few defensive guns, they were facing an entire convoy acting like a moving anti-aircraft battery. German mission reports from this period began mentioning unusually heavy ground fire from Allied transport columns. Some pilots described the experience as flying into a storm of tracers. Others reported breaking off attacks early because the defensive fire was simply too intense. The M2 Browning had turned logistics vehicles into something the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. Trucks that once carried only fuel and ammunition were now capable of defending themselves with lethal efficiency. Every convoy had become a potential trap. And as these encounters multiplied across North Africa, the message spread quickly among German pilots. Attacking Allied supply lines was no longer the easy mission it had once been. Now it was a gamble. one that increasingly ended with damaged aircraft, wounded pilots, or planes that never returned to base.
By the spring of 1943, the skies over North Africa had become far more dangerous for German pilots than they had been just a few months earlier. What once seemed like simple and effective missions, low-level attacks on Allied supply convoys, were now producing losses that alarmed commanders across the Luftwaffe. Convoy strafing had once been considered one of the most efficient ways to weaken an enemy army. Destroy the trucks carrying fuel and ammunition, and entire armored units could grind to a halt. German pilots had used this strategy repeatedly during the early stages of the North African campaign, but now the same tactics were beginning to cost them aircraft. The problem was simple but deadly. To attack trucks effectively, pilots had to fly low and straight. That placed them directly in the range of the heavy machine guns mounted across American convoys. The weapon most responsible for this sudden danger was the M2 Browning. Its powerful .50 caliber rounds could reach attacking aircraft long before they finished their strafing run. At first, German pilots assumed they could adapt. Some tried approaching from higher altitudes before diving down at the last moment. Others attempted faster passes, hoping speed would reduce their exposure to ground fire. But the problem remained the same. The moment an aircraft committed to the attack, it had to pass directly over vehicles bristling with heavy machine guns. And those guns were everywhere. A single convoy might stretch for kilometers across the desert. Trucks, half-tracks, and jeeps moved in long columns, raising massive clouds of dust behind them. Mounted on many of these vehicles were the unmistakable silhouettes of heavy machine guns pointed skyward, waiting. For a pilot flying a fighter such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the attack often began with confidence. The aircraft would descend rapidly toward the convoy, lining up along the column of vehicles. But as the plane dropped lower, the first tracers usually appeared, thin, glowing lines racing upward from the desert floor. Within seconds, dozens more followed. Instead of scattered defensive fire, the attacking aircraft faced an expanding storm of bullets. Streams of tracer rounds rose from multiple directions as gunners tracked the incoming plane. The closer the aircraft came, the thicker the fire became. Pilots who had previously attacked British convoys were stunned by the difference. Earlier in the campaign, defensive fire had often been light and disorganized. Now it was intense and coordinated, with multiple guns engaging the aircraft simultaneously. Even dive bombers were no longer safe. The Junkers U-87 Stuka had once dominated the skies during earlier German campaigns. Its steep dive allowed pilots to deliver bombs with frightening accuracy. But in North Africa, the same dive that made it effective also made it vulnerable. During the final seconds of its descent, the aircraft slowed dramatically, giving convoy gunners valuable time to aim. A Stuka diving toward a convoy often had to fly directly through a wall of tracer fire. Even if the bombs hit their targets, the aircraft still had to pull up and escape through the same storm of bullets. German mission reports from this period began to show a clear pattern. Pilots described attacks where the defensive fire was so intense that they had to break off before completing their runs. Others reported aircraft returning to base riddled with bullet holes. Some never returned at all. Losses began to accumulate across the Mediterranean theater. Between late 1942 and the middle of 1943, the Luftwaffe lost thousands of aircraft operating in the region. According to wartime records, more than 2,000 German aircraft were destroyed during this period, a staggering loss for an air force already stretched across multiple fronts. While not all of these losses came from convoy attacks, the growing danger of ground fire forced German commanders to reconsider their tactics. Pilots were increasingly warned about heavily armed Allied transport columns. What had once been considered easy targets were now treated with caution. Some Luftwaffe units began limiting low-altitude strafing missions altogether.
Others shifted their focus towards bombing larger installations or attacking isolated targets instead of entire convoys. The risk of flying directly into dozens of heavy machine guns was becoming difficult to justify. Among pilots themselves, the reputation of American convoys spread quickly. Stories circulated about columns of trucks that seemed to erupt in fire the moment aircraft appeared overhead. Some described the experience as flying through a wall of tracers. Others used less polite language to describe the chaos of bullets filling the sky. Confidence, which had once defined convoy hunting missions, slowly began to disappear. Pilots still attacked when ordered, but they knew the risks had changed. Every strafing run now carried the possibility that a single lucky round could cripple their aircraft. A damaged engine over the desert could mean a crash landing far from friendly lines. The balance of danger had shifted. What had once been a one-sided hunt was becoming something far closer to a duel between aircraft and convoy gunners. And with every month that passed, the Luftwaffe was learning a painful lesson about the consequences of underestimating an enemy's ability to defend even its most ordinary vehicles.
By the time the fighting in North Africa reached its final stages in 1943, something remarkable had become clear to both sides of the war. The trucks that once seemed like the weakest part of an army had become some of the most dangerous targets a pilot could attack. Supply convoys were no longer helpless lines of vehicles crawling across the desert. They had become armed formations capable of defending themselves with surprising effectiveness. At the center of this transformation was the heavy machine gun known as the M2 Browning. What made this weapon extraordinary was not only its power, but how widely it was used. By the time American forces fully entered the North African campaign, the weapon had become standard equipment across much of the U.S. Army's vehicle fleet. Trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, armored cars, and even some utility vehicles carried the gun. In many convoys, nearly every few vehicles had a mounted heavy machine gun ready to fire. The idea behind this approach was simple. Every unit, even logistics units, should have the ability to defend itself if attacked. This philosophy was very different from how many other armies organized their transport forces. In earlier stages of the war, logistics columns were often treated as rear area assets. They were expected to stay behind the front lines and rely on air cover or escort units for protection. But the vast distances and chaotic nature of the North African battlefield made that approach dangerous. Front lines could shift quickly across hundreds of kilometers of desert. Supply trucks frequently traveled through areas where enemy aircraft might suddenly appear. American planners believed that relying entirely on fighter cover was unrealistic. Instead, they designed convoys that could immediately respond to attacks on their own. The result was a doctrine of self-defending logistics. Convoy crews were trained not just to drive and maintain vehicles, but also to operate heavy weapons. Drivers, mechanics, and transport soldiers learned how to track aircraft with the heavy machine guns mounted behind their seats. Ammunition boxes were stacked near the guns so gunners could reload quickly during an attack. When aircraft appeared, every gun in the convoy could join the defense within seconds. This approach created something the Luftwaffe had not fully anticipated. Instead of encountering isolated defensive guns, German pilots were now facing entire supply columns capable of producing dense anti-aircraft fire. Even though each individual gun was relatively small compared to dedicated anti-aircraft artillery, the combined effect of many guns firing together proved extremely dangerous. The heavy rounds fired by the M2 Browning were particularly effective against aircraft operating at low altitude. Fighters and dive bombers needed to descend close to the ground to accurately strafe vehicles. But that same altitude placed them directly within the most lethal range of the machine guns.
Over time, this forced pilots to reconsider how they attacked. Some began making faster passes from higher altitudes, reducing their accuracy but improving their chances of survival. Others avoided attacking convoys entirely unless the target was especially important. The simple presence of heavy machine guns across American vehicles had changed the tactical equation. What made the weapon even more remarkable was its reliability. The design created by John Moses Browning had proven durable under almost any conditions. In the harsh desert environment, where sand, dust, and heat destroyed many types of equipment, the heavy machine gun continued to function. Crews could clean it quickly, reload it easily, and fire it for extended periods without failure. This reliability ensured that the weapon remained ready whenever aircraft appeared overhead. As the North African campaign drew closer to its conclusion, the influence of this doctrine became impossible to ignore. Supply convoys that once had been viewed as vulnerable logistical assets were now recognized as moving defensive formations. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition had become part of the battlefield in ways few planners had originally expected. The success of this approach did not end in North Africa. The same heavy machine gun would continue to appear on American vehicles throughout the rest of the war. From the mountains of Italy to the forests of Western Europe and the islands of the Pacific, the weapon remained a constant presence. Even after the Second World War ended, the legacy continued. The M2 Browning remained in service during the Korean War and later during the Vietnam War. Decades after its original design, it was still mounted on military vehicles around the world. What began as a weapon intended to counter armored aircraft during the final years of the First World War had evolved into one of the most enduring and versatile weapons in military history. And in the deserts of North Africa, it had quietly changed the rules of the battlefield. For the pilots who once hunted convoys across the empty sands, the lesson had been learned the hard way. A line of trucks might look harmless from the sky, but sometimes those trucks were armed, waiting, and capable of turning a routine attack into a deadly mistake.